The rain had come down hard that morning, soaking the streets in a slick film of gray that seemed to cling to everything it touched. Malik's boots, torn at the seams and scuffed from years of wear, made no sound as he stepped through the underground parking entrance. His hoodie, damp from the walk, clung to his back, drawing a shiver that traveled down his spine and settled deep in his bones. He was used to it. Cold, wet, ignored conditions that had come to define his existence in this towering city of steel and silence. The building above him rose 40 stories, glass-wrapped and godlike, its name etched in gold above the revolving doors. It was the kind of place where power wore suits and shoes without scuffs, where the elevator never paused at the maintenance floor, where no one knew what the basement looked like. But Malik did. It was where he spent the past 4 years, quietly, anonymously, precisely. He moved down the hallway toward the janitor's storage, the key still warm in his pocket. Inside, the light flickered once before steadying, casting a pale glow across the shelves of bleaches, brushes, and unmarked rags. He knelt down, reaching behind a rusted pipe to retrieve a thick folder bound in elastic, worn at the corners, edges curled like burned paper. Inside, his blueprints. Dozens of them painstakingly drawn by hand, then rendered digitally at a 24-hour print shop downtown. Each page marked with fine lines of angles, loads, zoning specs, an architectural dream that started on napkins and grew through sleepless nights into the full set of documents for the Westbridge expansion project. No one in the building knew he was its true architect. Officially, he was anonymous, his LLC veiled behind trustees and legal fog, his shares held silently, his presence scrubbed from the boardroom table. But he didn't care about recognition, not yet. He cared about ownership, and that he had secured. The building was bought out 5 months ago in a quiet acquisition. The holding firm had signed the deeds and transferred the rights. Malik was now the legal owner of the property that once spat him out daily with mop and bucket in hand. But he stayed. On purpose. Not to gloat. Not to spy. But to see how they treated him still when he had everything. They didn't disappoint. Just last week, a woman in stilettos barked at him for standing too long in the hallway. A security guard shoved him aside with a sneer. One of the upper-floor assistants threw a coffee-stained napkin at his feet without looking. He smiled through it. Every insult was a note in his mental ledger. Every slight was a reminder of why he kept quiet. Let them choke on their arrogance. Let them drown in their reflections. He took the elevator to the 39th floor after hours, a keycard borrowed months ago still functional. The top floor was unfinished, a raw space with wires hanging from the ceiling, drywall exposed in patches, and windows stretching floor to ceiling in a panoramic view of the entire city. He walked to the far edge and stared. The skyline blinked back at him through fog and light. He breathed deeply. This would be the new headquarters, his design, his dream. It was hard to imagine that just 5 years ago he was sleeping in his car. Back then he had nothing but debt, sketches, and a bitter resolve. He took night shifts, scrubbing tiles and replacing bulbs, watching how the city moved from beneath its skin. He absorbed everything: patterns, waste, inefficiencies. While others threw blueprints into bins after meetings, he retrieved them. Learned from them. Improved on them. Eventually he pitched. Quietly, strategically. Investors didn't see the hoodie, only the numbers. And the numbers he made sing. A distant sound broke the silence. Laughter. Someone else was on the floor. He froze. Then retreated to a pillar, ducking into the shadow, ears sharp. It was construction crew, late-night walkthroughs, 2 men in hard hats, talking casually about tomorrow's launch. They joked about the press event, about the champagne, about how the boss wouldn't show up. Probably too rich to breathe the same air, one said. Malik smiled again. They passed without noticing him. He waited, then stepped back into the light. The rain outside had slowed, and the windows bore the streaks of retreating weather like scars. He stood there for a long time, unmoving, as if absorbing the city's weight through the soles of his boots. Then he turned and walked away, past steel beams and coiled cables, down the stairs instead of the elevator, back to the basement, back to the shadows. He didn't need to rush. Tomorrow would come, and tomorrow they would see. Morning arrived with an air of spectacle. The sky over the city was a dull, cloudless sheet, the kind of gray that turned everything metallic sharp. The street in front of the tower pulsed with unfamiliar energy. Traffic cones cordoned off curbs, black SUVs lined the block, and men in suits clustered around clipboards and walkie-talkies. A red carpet had been unfurled across the entryway like a tongue, and banners flanked the entrance, bearing the bold lettering of the new Westbridge expansion. It was the event of the quarter. CEOs, architects, influencers, media, all converged to toast the unveiling of the city's latest commercial marvel. Malik stood on the opposite side of the street, unnoticed. His hoodie was zipped halfway, his jeans still wet from brushing against a morning puddle. A crumpled piece of bread in his hand passed for breakfast. No camera turned his way. No security guard paused at his presence. In their eyes, he didn't belong. That was the point. He crossed when the light changed, slipping between the flow of attendees, weaving around the photographers and their flashes. No one stopped him, but they looked. Brief, disgusted glances, the kind that tried to push someone out of existence. He felt them hit like static against his skin. But he kept walking. Inside, the lobby had been transformed. Chandeliers had been unboxed and lifted into place just that morning, their crystals still smelling faintly of packing foam. Velvet ropes steered visitors toward escalators, where each floor had been prepared with showcases and sample displays. Floor 25 hosted a co-working concept. 34 featured retail concepts still under wraps. And the 39th, that was the crown jewel. But for now, guests were kept in the lower levels for interviews, cocktails, and speeches. Malik moved past a catering table, grabbed a paper napkin, and wiped his hands. A woman behind the table stiffened. She looked at his clothes, her nose wrinkling. Then she turned her back to him. Another mark on his mental scorecard. He walked toward the elevator bank, where a group in matching blazers had formed a semicircle around an investor presentation. They didn't see him approach until he stepped too close. One of them moved instinctively between Malik and the screen, blocking him. "Can I help you?" the gesture said, though no words were used. Malik looked at the man's ID badge, which bore the logo of the same holding company he now controlled. The irony tickled him. He gave a short nod and stepped back. It wasn't time yet. Let them dance. Let them perform. He took the service stairwell to the third floor, bypassing the polished paths laid out for the elite. Here, the building still breathed in its rawest state, wires exposed, pipes hissing occasionally behind drywall. He moved with purpose, tracing hallways he had memorized during construction. Each turn brought memories. Where a contractor had argued over materials, where a structural engineer had called his math too ambitious, where a developer had scoffed at the idea of mixed-use floors. Now all of it stood, real, permanent, signed by hands they'd never bothered to look at. From a maintenance shaft on floor 12, Malik accessed a utility elevator rarely used. It ascended slowly, with the gentle whine of effort, and opened into a hallway that led directly to the top. No one waited on the 39th. The guests hadn't yet been ushered up. He emerged into the expanse of polished floor-to-ceiling windows, light bouncing off surfaces like it was trying to escape the walls. A makeshift bar stood in one corner, unopened bottles lined up in military precision. A podium was already placed center stage. Behind it, a screen waited to display the key slides of the presentation, one of which bore his name. Not the name they all knew him by, but the legal name tied to his holding company, to the deeds, to the title, Malik E.R. Winters. The middle initials were his father's. A man who never lived to see his son become more than a statistic. A man who died in a sanitation truck accident, whose obituary was one line beneath an ad for used cars. Malik stood before the podium now and looked down at the gathering below. Tiny figures moved through the lobby with mechanical grace, champagne flutes raised, laughter echoing upward in brittle bursts. They thought this was theirs. They had no idea. He retreated from the window and made his way to the private office suite behind the display room. It had been left empty intentionally to be shown as customizable for future tenants. Inside, a small closet held backup supplies and a single locker. He opened it. Inside was a suit freshly pressed and sealed in a plastic wrap from a corner dry cleaner. Beneath it, a leather portfolio. He unwrapped the suit slowly, ran his fingers along the seams. It wasn't expensive. Not by their standards. But it was clean. Sharp. Enough. He changed quickly, hiding his old clothes in the locker. When he looked in the mirror, he no longer looked like the man they'd ignore. But the eyes, those hadn't changed. Still quiet. Still measuring. The time approached. Downstairs, the keynote speaker was being introduced. He would let them finish. He wanted them to be at their most comfortable, their most self-assured. When he walked in, he wouldn't say anything. He wouldn't raise his voice. He would stand still, and when the time was right, the screen behind the podium would flash his name. And the looks on their faces would say the rest. The microphone crackled to life in the lobby's main event space. An MC, polished in tone and posture, took center stage with the confidence of someone certain they were in control. Guests turned their attention toward him, glasses paused midair, conversations dimmed. The speech was a familiar composition of buzzwords: innovation, future, sustainability, vision. The crowd responded with nods and shallow smiles, sipping their flutes in synchronization like a choreographed act. None of them noticed the man descending silently in the elevator at the far end of the building, the owner. Malik stood within the mirrored walls of the executive lift, the suit on his shoulders fitting well enough, the leather portfolio tucked beneath one arm. His reflection stared back at him with a kind of settled silence. He didn't feel nervous. He felt inevitable. The elevator doors opened to the back of the lobby where a hallway shielded the main reception. From here, the stage and screens were visible, but the crowd had their backs to him. He waited for the cue. The presentation was almost over. On stage, the speaker moved into the final slide, honoring the visionary behind it all. The audience stirred with mild curiosity. Whispers began to circulate. Had the architect arrived after all? Was there a donor nobody knew about? The slide changed. A name appeared in bold: Malik E.R. Winters, Principal, ERW Holdings. There was a full 2 seconds of silence before any reaction took shape. Then came the confusion. Then the glances. A few heads turned. And then one woman pointed toward the back of the lobby toward Malik, who had begun walking slowly down the center of the hall, past rows of white-draped tables, toward the stage. Every step he took peeled back another layer of their certainty. He was familiar. Too familiar. The realization came in waves, hitting different people at different times. It was him. The janitor. Mouths opened but said nothing. A photographer raised their camera, lowered it again, unsure. One of the executives, a man who once barked at Malik for tracking dust near his Audi, stepped aside as if the approaching figure would dirty his air. Malik reached the edge of the stage and paused. No one moved to stop him. He ascended the 3 short steps and took his place behind the podium, facing them all. His hands were steady. His posture calm. Behind him, the screen began to rotate through the plans: real estate layouts, cross-sections, elevation renderings, each marked with his signature and company seal. There was no speech prepared. He didn't need one. The silence said enough. He scanned the room. Some people looked away. Others stared as if trying to rewrite what they'd seen in their minds. He recognized faces. People who had thrown away napkins at his feet, who had told him to move, who never returned his nods in the hallway. One woman, now pale, had once asked if he was in the wrong building. Another, blinking rapidly, had snapped her fingers at him when she spilled coffee. All of them now sat in chairs paid for by his signature, under a ceiling raised by his vision. He gave them a single nod, turned, and left the stage. The room remained hushed. The MC tried to recover, stepping back into the spotlight, his voice softer now, less certain. Malik didn't hear what he said. He walked through the exit corridor calmly, past stunned assistants, past a security guard who had once shoved him aside in the service hallway. Their eyes followed him, wide and unsure. No one moved to challenge him now. Outside, the air had shifted. The sun had broken through the clouds for the first time all day, lighting the glass of the skyscraper in a way that made it look molten, alive. He stood beneath its towering face and watched as reflections of himself multiplied in its windows, no longer as a janitor, but as a man who built what others merely rented. He didn't return to the shadows that night. He didn't change back into his old clothes. Instead, he walked the city as it buzzed past him, head high, eyes forward, feet finally free from shame. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to exhale without fear of being noticed. At a corner cafe, he sat by the window with a coffee in hand, steam rising to meet the crisp air. A child walked by with his father, tugging his sleeve and pointing toward the tower. "Look at that building," the boy said. "I want to build one like that someday." The father smiled and nodded. Malik watched them disappear into the crowd. And then he smiled too. The days that followed unraveled like a fabric being pulled thread by thread. News traveled fast, but disbelief traveled faster. The video clip of Malik standing at the podium, dressed in an unbranded suit, eyes unwavering as the screen behind him flashed his name, circulated among industry circles like contraband. At first, they thought it was a stunt, a mistaken identity, a trick. But then came the confirmations, legal documents, ownership filings, press releases bearing his initials. ERW Holdings, they learned, was real, and he was its founder. The building wasn't just his latest project. It was the flagship. Some tried to frame it as a Cinderella story, but they couldn't find a photo of him in a tuxedo or a fairy godmother to credit. Others turned on themselves, issuing apologies that arrived as late as their respect. An internal email chain from the property's former board leaked. Words like scruffy, low rank, nobody appeared too often. A few quietly resigned. A few more tried to arrange meetings. But Malik ignored them all. He returned to the tower the next Monday, not through the service entrance, not through the underground. He entered through the main lobby, where every guard now recognized his face. He wore the same hoodie not out of defiance, but because it was his. Every step he took was casual but calculated. People stared. Some whispered. Some looked away entirely. The building now responded to him differently. Doors opened faster. Elevators didn't hesitate. The staff was instructed to greet him by name. But he didn't return their politeness, not yet. He headed for the office suite on the 39th floor, the one he had stood in while changing, the one staged for high-paying tenants. It was his now. A nameplate bearing M.E.R. Winters had been installed beside the door. The room smelled of new paint and expensive silence. He sat by the window for most of the morning, watching as the city breathed beneath him, unaware of how much had changed. A call came in at noon, his legal team confirming the successful acquisition of an adjacent property. The tower was expanding again. Phase 2. He approved it with a single word. After lunch, a photographer from a major magazine arrived for a profile shoot. Malik agreed, but on one condition: no retouching, no wardrobe stylist. He stood in front of his own blueprints, hoodie on, hands in his pockets. The magazine called the piece "The Man They All Overlooked." At street level, the building's new plaque was installed: Westbridge Plaza, a property of ERW Holdings. No mention of tenants. No names but his. But not everyone was adjusting quietly. One of the former executives, Dawson Langford, had filed a formal request to dispute ownership. Malik had expected it. Langford was the kind of man who had once told Malik, mop in hand, to clear the hallway faster next time. The irony was delicious. But Malik didn't respond with press releases or legal threats. He responded with paperwork. Quiet, crushing paperwork. Contracts. Transaction receipts. Lawyer-certified, time-stamped filings. Langford's motion was denied before it ever reached a hearing. Inside the tower, employees began to speak of Malik in reverent tones. The man who watched and remembered everything. The man who listened more than he spoke. A janitor turned owner. It sounded impossible, even magical. But the documents were real. The leases were real. The power was real. And it made some of them nervous. Because if someone like him could do this, then none of them were safe in their certainty. He passed a group of them one afternoon, young analysts, interns, junior managers huddled in the break room, their conversation dissolving into silence as he entered. He didn't look at them. He poured coffee, black, no sugar, then stood by the window. One of them, a woman with round glasses, finally asked what everyone was afraid to say. "Why did you stay? After everything?" He didn't answer. He just sipped his coffee. The question didn't deserve an answer. The city had asked it his whole life, and he had already replied with glass and steel. Late that evening, when the floors had emptied and the building exhaled its daily tension, Malik walked the hallways alone. He visited every corner he had once cleaned, every corridor that had echoed with indifference. He stood in silence where people used to pass him like furniture. It no longer hurt. It no longer mattered. Because the floors he once mopped were now floors he owned. And the lights that used to glare down on him were now lights powered by his grid, paid by his bank. He paused in front of the janitor's closet. The same one where he had hidden his blueprints, where he had changed his clothes, where he had learned to build in darkness. The lock had been replaced. Inside, it was spotless: no more mop, no more chemicals, no more folded sketches. Just a sealed folder with a gold-embossed logo, ERW Holdings. He left it there, not as a reminder of where he came from, but as proof that no place can hold you unless you let it. Tomorrow, he'd meet with city planners for a new project. A community center in the same district where he used to sleep in his car. No fanfare. No press. Just another building. Another answer to the world that once looked at him and said, "You're too dirty to be in here." He would keep building. Let them keep watching. Rain returned to the city in waves, not with violence, but with persistence, the kind of slow, steady downpour that slicks the sidewalks and mutes the skyline. It pooled in the alleyways where Malik used to park his car, back when it was both shelter and shame. Now, those alleys ran behind buildings with his name on the deeds, though he never marked them. He didn't want statues or plaques or dedications. He wanted permanence. He wanted roots in concrete. He wanted to build spaces that couldn't be erased the way he had been so many times. On the edge of South Hill, a forgotten district lined with shuttered laundromats and broken signage, stood the hollow skeleton of what used to be an elementary school. Malik stood in front of it now, hard hat on, hands in pockets, as surveyors and contractors moved around him. The city had offered to demolish the place years ago, calling it a blight. But Malik had other plans. He had purchased the lot through a quiet proxy deal and announced its redevelopment as a public resource center. A place for education, nutrition, training, childcare. Not because it would profit, because it was owed. He remembered what it felt like to be 10 years old and kicked out of the school library for not wearing clean enough shoes. He remembered stealing napkins from diners to draw buildings on. He remembered being told, "People like you don't get to build anything." This center would be the answer to all of it, and he wouldn't put his name above the door. The local news asked for interviews, but Malik declined. His team handled logistics, zoning, and budgets. He focused on the shape of the space, the way light would fall through the atrium, the acoustics of the open halls, the texture of the walls where children's fingers would trace shapes. He designed every room not with prestige, but with memory. At night, he returned to Westbridge. The tower remained fully occupied, its tenants unaware that their leases were being renewed under new terms. More affordable rates for select businesses, subsidized space for startups, rent forgiveness for struggling employees. His accountants questioned the logic. But Malik didn't build by their numbers. He built by something else entirely. In one of the lower retail levels, a woman ran a small bookstore. She had once tried to give him change when she mistook him for a homeless man browsing to stay warm. Now she received a letter and signed that her lease had been paid in full for the next 3 years. Upstairs, a cafe owner who offered Malik a free sandwich during a forgotten evening received a grant envelope marked Expansion Assistance. Across the building, little acts of unrecorded grace unfolded. No press, no names. Just corrections to a ledger the world never kept. But not everyone appreciated the shift. Investors began to call. Whispers spread that Malik's sentimental practices could affect returns. Meetings were scheduled, emails grew pointed. One board member insisted on a formal confrontation. Malik agreed. The meeting was held on the 39th floor, in the very room where the launch had happened. They sat across from each other. Malik calm, the board member restless, flipping through spreadsheets and forecasts. He spoke of concerns, of responsibility to stakeholders, of optics. Malik listened without interruption. Then he stood, walked to the window, and pointed to the city below. "There," he said at last, gesturing toward South Hill. "That's the future dividend." The board member didn't understand, but it didn't matter. Malik had controlling interest. He wasn't looking for consensus. He was establishing terms. Afterward, he rode the elevator alone. The ride was quiet, smooth, humming like a machine that finally recognized its master. As he descended, memories flickered through the floors. Each level a version of himself he'd once been. Janitor, dreamer, architect, ghost. By the time the doors opened in the lobby, he was simply himself. Whole. A child waited near the entrance, tugging at his mother's coat, pointing toward a large map of the building's upcoming developments. Malik knelt beside him, said nothing, just watched the boy's finger trace imaginary paths through the tower. The child smiled and said he wanted to build one too. Malik nodded once, and in that moment, the boy didn't see a CEO or a janitor or anyone extraordinary. He saw someone who listened. That was enough. Outside, the rain began to ease. The sidewalks glistened. The city exhaled. And Malik walked into the night, still building not just structures but futures. Dawn broke quietly over the city, spilling amber light across glass towers and tangled streets. The skyline looked cleaner in the early hours, before the horns and footsteps and commerce reclaimed it. Malik stood at the edge of the rooftop garden on Westbridge's highest level, a space that didn't exist in the original architectural plans. It had been his final addition, not for meetings, not for show, just a place above the noise where one could remember. Beneath him, the city moved in slow circles, delivery vans gliding like beetles across asphalt, buses dragging early commuters through gridlocked veins, office lights blinking on one by one like a system waking from sleep. He sipped his tea slowly. It was quiet here. Honest. He had created a space where nothing was demanded of him, not performance, not penance, not proof. No one could throw him out anymore. And still, sometimes he remembered the sting of being told to leave. Not because it still hurt, but because it anchored him to purpose. His phone buzzed with updates. A new development had broken ground across town. The community center was ahead of schedule. Applications had flooded in for free business incubator slots. A youth program had filled its first class before registration even opened publicly. Every corner of the city he had once been invisible in was now changing, not through force, but through quiet redefinition. He descended the staircase rather than take the elevator, passing floors that once saw him as a shadow. On 32, he paused. A tenant was moving out, a design firm that had outgrown their space. The hallway was lined with boxes. A young man, maybe 25, struggled to lift one. Malik stopped beside him and offered to help. The young man hesitated but accepted. They carried the box together to the elevator. "You work here?" the man asked. Malik just smiled. By the time the elevator opened, someone else was waiting to enter, an older man in a fitted coat, briefcase polished to perfection. He looked at Malik, then the box, then back again. Recognition flickered in his eyes. He stepped aside, silent. This was happening more often now, people realizing who he was after it was too late to correct their behavior. Malik never said anything. He let them carry their own discomfort. Downstairs, he stepped out onto the plaza. It was bustling with vendors preparing for the midday market, an idea Malik had funded after watching food trucks circle the block with nowhere to park. A woman running a small stall called his name. She'd once shouted at him for tracking in mud. Now she offered him a basket of fruit, fresh and warm from the sun. He accepted it without hesitation. Not to prove anything, just to take part in the world he was building. The rest of the day passed like most days now. Meetings, approvals, site visits. But nothing ever felt routine. Every brick, every floor plan, every signature was an act of defiance against the narrative the world once handed him. He still walked the city every night, not for exercise, but for confirmation, proof that what he built was being used, touched, lived in. On one of those walks, he paused by a window and watched a class in session, children seated around tables, drawing imaginary cities with crayons. He watched until they noticed him and waved. He waved back. Weeks later, Malik received an invitation to speak at an exclusive real estate summit. His name was printed alongside CEOs and moguls he used to mop around. He declined. Instead, he gave the slot to a young architect from the program he had funded, someone who had grown up 2 blocks from where Malik once slept in his car. Let them hear a new voice. Years passed. Projects multiplied. Westbridge became more than a tower. It became a symbol, a quiet rebuttal to arrogance, to blindness, to assumptions. People still whispered about the janitor who built it all. Malik never corrected them. Let the myth serve its purpose. On the 15th anniversary of the tower's opening, a new plaque was installed in the lobby, not by Malik's request, but by the tenants themselves. It bore a single sentence. He didn't ask to be seen. He made himself undeniable. By then, Malik no longer needed buildings to feel solid. He walked among his legacy, not above it. He had nothing to prove, no one to impress. And every time someone new looked at him with disbelief, he simply smiled. Because the dirt they feared had built the foundation they now stood on. And he would never be too dirty to be anywhere again.